Ideas are powerful things. Good ideas build societies. Bad ideas corrode them from within and rarely stay confined to their own borders. When the United Nations passed Resolution 3379, declaring Zionism a form of racism, the US ambassador to the UN, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, understood immediately what had been unleashed. An evil, he said, has been loosed upon the world, and historians would one day reckon with the damage. Today, 50 years later, with the benefit of hindsight on our side, we can do just that. As the president just described, his father, Chaim Herzog, Israel's ambassador to the UN, famously raised the resolution from the rostrum and tore it in half, declaring that for the Jewish people it was just a piece of paper. And he was right. The perverse statement that, as Tamir said, was born of Soviet cynicism coupled with Arab state opportunism would not define Jewish self-determination. We Jews have long resisted the attempts of others to define us. In a few days, Jewish communities around the world will be celebrating the holiday of Hanukkah, a holiday that recalls Greek accusations of Jewish misanthropy. Later, in the Christian era, Jews came to embody the antithesis of the Christian ideal, the Antichrist. With the decline of religion and rise of scientific thought, Jews were recast as scientifically inferior. And in the post-World War II age that sees human rights as a kind of universal civic religion, Israel and Zionism have been cast as the embodiment of everything imagined to violate those rights. The paper that Herzog tore in half, however, proved to be remarkably durable. It migrated from the halls of the UN into human rights reports, to campuses around the world, and finally into all of our palms scrolling through our TikTok feeds. How did it happen? Was it inevitable, just another wave in the vast and stormy ocean of millennia-old hostility to Jews? No. Its metastasis was not the result of historical inevitability, but of conceptual elasticity, activated by political actors who repurposed old tropes and have aligned them with prevailing moral attitudes and vocabularies. Although most people familiar with the Zionism-racism equation think of November 10th, 1975 as its genesis, it actually surfaced a decade earlier at the United Nations during debates on the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In those proceedings, ironically on a clause to denounce anti-Semitism, the Soviet delegate proposed adding Zionism to the list of ideologies to be condemned alongside Nazism. The move served two purposes. One, to deflect scrutiny from the Soviets' own anti-Semitic policies, and two, to ensure that the entire effort would collapse, which it did. The clause was dropped, but the idea remained, and it was popularized following the Six-Day War. 9 years later, in 1974, the Arab bloc sought to have Israel expelled from the UN. When that effort failed, they doubled down on their campaign to denounce Zionism. In minutes from those meetings, we can already see some of the bizarre inversions that we hear today, such as the Syrian delegate insistence that the Arab states could not be accused of anti-Semitism if they themselves were Semites. After Resolution 3379 passed, Israeli diplomats, Jewish organizations, and international parliamentarians spent 16 years lobbying in a coordinated effort to have it revoked. In 1991, in the midst of the Gulf War and Madrid peace process, the General Assembly finally repealed the resolution. Fukuyama famously called this period the end of history, and President Bush depicted the New World Order as the dawn of a new era. But Zionism as racism lived on. In large part, this endurance was due to a second resolution passed on November 10th, 1975. That was not repealed in 91, Resolution 3376, which established SEREP, a body at the United Nations that was mandated to promote Palestinian rights at the UN while also undermining Israel's legitimacy. Through its agencies, SEREP worked hand in hand with civil society groups, creating an annual Nakba Day to decry Israel's creation, funding conferences, and distributing reports that depicted Israel in the most egregious terms. Its outreach to civil society was an explicit and declared goal. Civil society's role in this whole story reached its apex at the NGO Forum of the World Conference Against Racism and Xenophobia held in Durban, South Africa in 2001. 8,000 delegates attended, representing groups that championed women's rights, groups that were fighting modern forms of slavery and human trafficking, and many more of the most critical human rights issues. But the anti-racism conference quickly derailed into a conference of racism, what Congressman Tom Lantos, himself a Holocaust survivor, described as the worst expression of anti-Semitism since the Holocaust. The NGO Forum displayed banners and distributed T-shirts that equated the Star of David with a swastika. Booklets from the Arab Lawyers Union depicted Israeli soldiers as Nazis. Inside the stadium, booths were set up that had caricatures of Jews drawn straight from the old Soviet playbooks, hook-nosed with blood dripping out of their fangs, trampling on innocent Palestinians. At a trade union rally, demonstrators held posters of Hitler with the caption, "What if I had won? The good, there would be no Israel." And you can see some of the images here. One week later, 2 planes crashed into New York City's Twin Towers, largely eclipsing the Durban fallout. But the groundwork had already been laid. In 2005, the BDS movement emerged after having coalesced at Durban, carrying the slogans from Soviet delegations to global civil society, now reframed in new idioms such as apartheid walls, settler colonialism, and indigenous rights. Over the next 2 decades, BDS kept the Zionism as racism analogy alive. It embedded the idea in university curricula, in church groups, in corporate shareholder meetings. And then social media did what social media does best. It supercharged the narrative, filtering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the prism of America's racial struggles, superficially trying to fit the US peace into the complex puzzle of the Middle East. By 2020, the shift was unmistakable. On elite campuses, growing numbers of students absorbed the idea that Zionism is inherently racist. What had at once been an obscure Cold War formulation now felt to young activists like an intuitive moral stance. Then came October 7th, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, and we might have thought that it would have shattered the narrative that saw Zionism as the central problem. Instead, on many campuses, often with faculty support, students declared Hamas resistance and doubled down on the Zionism as racism charge. Encampment manifestos likened Jewish self-determination to white supremacy. Speakers praised Intifada as anti-colonial emancipation. A Cornell professor said that the images on October 7th exhilarated him. And Columbia professor Joseph Massad wrote on October 8th, while terrorists were still looming in the South, that the massacre was a justified response to settler colonialism. So why does this formula endure? It endures because it is a powerful piece of political language, a phrase that collapses complex histories and flattens them into binaries that offer simple answers to complicated questions. It has produced a worldview that hijacks facts without letting the facts speak for themselves. None of this is to claim that Israel is perfect. No democracy is. And Israel, like any democracy, should be held to account through the due process mechanisms that exist internally to examine its conduct. But those who manufacture these narratives are not engaged in due process. They have often reached the verdict before evidence is even presented. So today, as we gather here to consider the legacy of this idea, let us remember that just as ideas, when unleashed, have the power to form, we, scholars and practitioners, have the power to resist them with evidence, with moral clarity, and with resolve. Thank you.